Hampshire, England, 1817. They say love conquers all. But what if love had to disguise itself as duty first? I, Eloise Hartwell, never imagined that my father's gambling debts would place me in the arms of a mysterious count, that a forced marriage would become the second chance my broken heart had awaited for years, that the stranger I was obligated to marry held a secret that would change everything. But what I truly didn't know is that sometimes fate needs to push us in the right direction, even when we fight against it. This is the story of a woman who was forced to sacrifice her freedom for her family, and discovered that the greatest love of her life had been waiting for her all along. But before we dive into this story that defies the conventions of Regency society, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. Truth is always more fascinating than fiction. There are moments in life when everything changes with the simple opening of a door. For me, that moment came on a dreary April afternoon when I was summoned to my father's study, a room I had learned to associate with unpleasant news and disappointments. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of our Hampshire estate, creating a melancholic soundtrack that seemed perfectly suited to what was about to unfold. I had always considered myself fortunate in one regard. At 23, I had escaped the desperate marriage market that consumed so many young women of my acquaintance. While my friends from finishing school had been paraded through London season after London season, evaluated like prize horses at Tattersall's, I had been granted a reprieve, not through any particular merit of my own, mind you, but rather through my father's general inattention to such matters, and my own studied determination to make myself as unremarkable as possible during our infrequent forays into society. The label of spinster had been applied to me with increasing frequency as I passed my 20th birthday, then my 21st, and finally my 22nd. I wore it like armor. There was a peculiar freedom in being dismissed by society. No one expected anything of you, which meant you could pursue your own interests without constant scrutiny. I had my books, my morning walks, my correspondence with former schoolmates who had been similarly cast aside by the marriage market. It was a quiet life, perhaps, but it was mine. That afternoon, as I entered my father's study and saw him hunched over his desk, his face gray with worry and what looked suspiciously like shame, I knew my peaceful existence was about to end. He did not meet my eyes as he spoke. His words came haltingly, each one seeming to cost him physically. The story he told was both predictable and devastating. Gambling debts accumulated over years, hidden from my mother and me through increasingly creative accounting, and the gradual sale of family heirlooms I had been too distracted to notice were missing. The creditors were no longer willing to wait. Our estate, held by my family for 4 generations, would be seized within the month, unless the debts were settled in full. The sum he mentioned made my stomach drop. It was insurmountable. Impossible. We had no wealthy relatives to appeal to, no family treasures remaining to sell. I thought of my mother, who had already endured so much disappointment in her marriage, and my younger sister Charlotte, barely 15, whose prospects would be destroyed entirely by our family's public ruin. Then my father mentioned the letter. He produced it from a drawer with trembling hands. Thick, expensive paper sealed with dark red wax bearing an unfamiliar coat of arms. A lion rampant surrounded by intertwined roses. The letter had arrived 3 days prior, he told me, though he had lacked the courage to mention it until now. It was from Sebastian Thorne, the Earl of Ashworth, a man I knew only as a name occasionally mentioned in the society pages of newspapers I rarely read. The Earl's proposal was straightforward in its audacity. He would settle all of my father's debts in their entirety in exchange for my hand in marriage. No courtship, no period of acquaintance, no pretense of affection. A business transaction dressed in the trappings of matrimony. I should have been outraged. A woman of more spirit might have refused immediately. Consequences be damned. But as I stood in that dim study, listening to the rain and my father's labored breathing, I felt only a strange numbness spreading through my chest. What choice did I have, really? If I refused, my mother would be cast into poverty, my sister's future destroyed before it even began. The shame would follow them everywhere, close every door, eliminate every possibility of happiness or security. My father had already accepted the proposal. This meeting was not a request for my permission, but rather an informing of a decision already made. The wedding would take place in 3 weeks' time. I would become the Countess of Ashworth, wife to a man I had never met, bound for life to a stranger whose motivations I could not begin to fathom. That evening, I stood at my bedroom window looking out over the gardens I had wandered freely for so many years. The rain had stopped, leaving everything dripping and gray. I tried to feel something: anger, fear, even resignation, but there was only that persistent numbness. In 3 weeks, I would leave this house, this life, everything familiar, and step into a future I could not imagine. I thought about the romantic novels I had read, where young women married for love, or at least for mutual respect and affection. I had long ago accepted that such stories were fantasies, but some small part of me had still harbored hope that if I ever married, it would be my own choice. That hope died that evening, drowned as thoroughly as the gardens outside my window. The following days passed in a blur of preparations that seemed both rushed and interminable. My mother alternated between tears and forced cheerfulness, trying to convince herself and me that this was not the disaster it so clearly was. Charlotte was kept largely ignorant of the true circumstances, told only that I had accepted a very advantageous proposal from a wealthy earl. She was young enough to find it romantic, this whirlwind marriage to a mysterious nobleman. I received a note from the earl himself 10 days before the wedding. His handwriting was bold and confident, the message brief. He would arrive 2 days before the ceremony to make my acquaintance. He hoped I would find Ashworth Manor to my liking. He signed it simply Ashworth, without any personal sentiment or attempt at warmth. I read that note dozens of times, searching for some clue to the man's character or motivations. Why would a wealthy earl choose such an unusual path to matrimony? Surely he could have his pick of eligible young women through traditional means. What did he want from this arrangement? What kind of man purchased a wife to settle gambling debts? The questions haunted me, but answers were not forthcoming. I could find very little information about Sebastian Thorne beyond the basics. He had inherited the title 2 years prior upon his uncle's death. He had spent several years on the continent before returning to England, and he was reputed to be quite wealthy, though the source of his fortune was somewhat mysterious. No scandals attached to his name, no whispers of impropriety or cruelty. He was simply unknown. 2 days before my wedding, I dressed with particular care, choosing a modest day dress of pale blue muslin that Charlotte insisted brought out my eyes. I arranged my dark hair in a simple style, pinned at the nape of my neck. I wanted to appear composed, dignified, even if internally I felt like I was preparing for my own execution. When the butler announced the Earl's arrival, my heart began to pound with an intensity that surprised me. I had convinced myself I was resigned to this fate, accepting of the necessity. But as I heard his footsteps approaching the drawing room where I waited with my parents, fear seized me with unexpected violence. The door opened, and my entire world shifted on its axis. He was tall, that was my first impression, with broad shoulders filling out his perfectly tailored coat of dark gray superfine. His hair was dark, almost black, falling slightly across his forehead in a way that suggested he had been traveling. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath in my chest. They were gray, like storm clouds, and as they fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, something stirred in my memory, something distant and half-forgotten but insistent. I knew this man, or I had known him once. The certainty of it hit me like a physical blow, even as I struggled to place how or where or when. He crossed the room with confident strides, and I noticed the slight hesitation in his movement as he drew near, as if he too felt the strange current in the air between us. When he bowed over my hand, his fingers were warm even through my gloves, and I felt an inexplicable tremor run through me at the contact. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and cultured, with the barest hint of something else beneath, an accent perhaps, or merely the careful control of someone used to guarding his words. He expressed his pleasure at finally meeting me, his hopes that I was well, all the proper phrases expected in such situations, but his eyes never left my face, searching it with an intensity that should have been unsettling, but instead felt almost familiar. We sat. Tea was served. Conversation unfolded with painful formality. My parents asked questions about Ashworth Manor, about his plans for after the wedding, about mundane details of estates and households. He answered with patience and courtesy, but I barely heard the words. I was too busy trying to understand why every fiber of my being was screaming that I knew this man, that I had known him, that this was not our first meeting despite all evidence to the contrary. When he spoke directly to me, assuring me that I would have complete freedom in managing the household and pursuing my own interests, that he expected nothing from me beyond the appearance of a respectable marriage, that I need not fear any unpleasantness in our arrangement. I should have been reassured. Instead, I felt a strange disappointment settling in my chest. Why would he go to such lengths to marry a woman he intended to essentially ignore? The visit lasted an hour. As he prepared to leave, promising to return for the ceremony in 2 days, he paused at the door and looked back at me. In that glance, I saw something flicker across his features. Longing, perhaps, or regret, or something else I could not name. Then it was gone, replaced by polite formality, and he was leaving, and I was standing in the drawing room feeling more confused than ever. That night, I lay awake long into the early hours, that face fixed in my mind, those storm-gray eyes, that familiar yet unfamiliar presence. Somewhere in the depths of my memory, something was trying to surface, but I could not quite grasp it. In 2 days, I would marry this stranger who was somehow not a stranger at all, and I had absolutely no idea what I was walking into. The morning of my wedding dawned gray and cool, with mist clinging to the gardens like a shroud. I had imagined this day countless times as a girl. What young woman doesn't? But never in any of those imaginings had I pictured myself dressing in silence, my hands steady not from calm, but from sheer numbness, preparing to bind myself to a man whose motivations remained a complete mystery to me. My wedding dress was modest, far simpler than what a countess might typically wear. Ivory silk with delicate embroidery at the hem and sleeves. It had belonged to my mother, and had been hastily altered to fit my slightly taller frame. Charlotte had woven small white roses into my hair, her hands gentle and her eyes bright with unshed tears she was trying valiantly to hide. She still believed this was a romantic tale, a rescue by a wealthy nobleman. I did not have the heart to disillusion her. My mother came to me as I stood before the mirror, seeing a stranger in the reflection. She placed her hands on my shoulders, and when I met her eyes in the glass, I saw guilt and gratitude warring in her expression. She told me I was saving the family, that my sacrifice would never be forgotten, that she prayed I would find happiness despite the circumstances of this union. Her voice broke on the last words, and I turned to embrace her, holding tight to the woman who had raised me, wondering when I would see her again after today. The ceremony itself was small, held in the chapel of our estate rather than in London, with all the pomp that usually accompanied the marriage of an earl. Only immediate family attended, my parents and Charlotte, and on the groom's side, no one at all. Sebastian Thorne stood alone at the altar, and something about that solitude tugged at something in my chest. What kind of man had no family or friends to witness his marriage? He turned as I entered, and once again I felt that shock of recognition, that insistent whisper in my mind that I knew him from somewhere. He wore black, immaculately tailored, with a waistcoat of dove-gray silk that somehow made his eyes appear even more intense. As I walked down the short aisle on my father's arm, Sebastian's gaze never wavered from my face, and I saw in his expression something that looked almost like pain. The vicar's words washed over me, familiar liturgy about duty and faithfulness, and the sacred bond of matrimony. I made my responses mechanically, my voice steady even as my heart raced. When it came time for Sebastian to speak his vows, I noticed his hands, bare now as mine were, trembled slightly. It was the first sign of nerves I had seen from him, and it made him suddenly, startlingly human rather than the enigmatic figure he had seemed. Then he was sliding a ring onto my finger, heavy gold, warm from his pocket, with a single deep blue sapphire that caught the candlelight. And the vicar was pronouncing us man and wife, husband and wife, earl and countess, bound together by words and law in a transaction I still did not fully understand. Sebastian lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to my knuckles that sent an unexpected shiver through me. His eyes met mine over our joined hands, and I saw in them such a complex mix of emotions, triumph, relief, tenderness, and that persistent sorrow, that I felt my breath catch. I was the Countess of Ashworth now, and I had never felt more lost in my entire life. The wedding breakfast was mercifully brief. My family made awkward conversation with my new husband while I sat silently, pushing food around my plate. Every time I glanced at Sebastian, I found him watching me with that same intense regard, as if memorizing every detail of my face. It should have made me uncomfortable, but instead it sparked that maddening sense of familiarity again. By early afternoon, it was time to leave. A luxurious carriage waited in the drive, the Ashworth coat of arms emblazoned on the door, that same lion rampant in roses I had first seen on the letter that changed my life. My trunk had already been loaded, containing what few possessions I would take to my new home. Everything else, my childhood, my freedom, my identity as simply Eloise Hartwell, would remain here. The goodbyes were painful. Charlotte clung to me, making me promise to write every week. My mother held me close, whispering prayers and blessings. My father, unable to meet my eyes, merely pressed a kiss to my forehead with shaking hands. Then Sebastian was handing me into the carriage, settling across from me rather than beside me, maintaining that careful distance he seemed to think I required. And we were moving, pulling away from the only home I had ever known. I watched through the window until the estate disappeared from view, then turned to face forward, blinking back tears I refused to let fall. When I finally looked at my husband, I found him still watching me with that penetrating gaze. He spoke then, his voice gentle, telling me that the journey to Somerset would take most of the day, that I should feel free to rest, that he had arranged for us to stop at a comfortable inn for refreshment. His words were kind, considerate, and completely impersonal. We could have been strangers sharing a public coach, rather than a newly married couple. The journey passed in near silence. I tried to read, but the words blurred before my eyes. Instead, I found myself stealing glances at the man across from me, trying to solve the puzzle he presented. He spent much of the journey looking out the window, his profile sharp and aristocratic against the changing landscape. Occasionally, he would turn and catch me looking, and a small, almost sad smile would touch his lips before he looked away again. We stopped once at a posting inn where Sebastian had arranged a private room for our meal. He was solicitous of my comfort, asking if I was warm enough, if the food was to my liking, if I needed to rest before continuing. His courtesy was impeccable and oddly frustrating. I found myself wanting to shake him, to demand why he was treating me like a fragile stranger, rather than the woman he had just married. As evening approached, the landscape changed, becoming more rugged and beautiful. Rolling hills gave way to more dramatic terrain, with ancient trees lining the roads and glimpses of moorland in the distance. Despite my turmoil, I could not help but appreciate the wild beauty of it all. Then, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, we rounded a bend and Ashworth Manor came into view. I gasped before I could stop myself. It was magnificent. A sprawling estate of honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the fading light, with multiple wings and towers, formal gardens visible even from a distance, and an overall impression of both grandeur and warmth. It was nothing like the rather plain Georgian house I had grown up in. This was the seat of real power and wealth, a statement of centuries of noble lineage. Sebastian was watching me again, and when I turned to meet his gaze, I saw something like hope in his expression. He asked if I approved, and I could not keep the wonder from my voice as I told him it was beautiful. The smile that lit his face transformed him entirely, making him appear younger, more open, and achingly familiar in a way that made my heart skip. The carriage pulled up to the main entrance, where what seemed like an army of servants waited in neat lines to greet their new mistress. Sebastian descended first, then handed me down with a touch that lingered just a moment longer than strictly necessary. As I stood beside him, his hand at the small of my back in a gesture that was both possessive and protective, the butler, a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes, welcomed me to Ashworth Manor. I was introduced to what felt like dozens of people, though I knew I would never remember all their names on first meeting. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, a plump woman with a motherly smile, promised to help me learn the household routines. The head gardener mentioned the rose garden that apparently rivaled those at some of the finest estates in England. The cook assured me that my preferences would be learned and accommodated. Through it all, Sebastian remained at my side, his presence steady and somehow reassuring, despite the strangeness of everything else. When the introductions finally concluded, he offered me his arm and guided me into the house, and I tried not to let my awe show too obviously as we entered a grand entrance hall with soaring ceilings, marble floors, and a massive chandelier that sparkled like captured starlight. He led me on a brief tour, pointing out the main rooms I would need to know: the drawing room, the morning room, the dining room with its table that could seat 40. Then, with something that almost looked like nervousness, he showed me to my chambers. They were more than chambers. They were an entire suite of rooms that connected to his own through a door that he pointedly told me would remain locked unless I wished otherwise. My sitting room was decorated in soft greens and golds, with windows overlooking the gardens. The bedroom beyond was spacious and elegant, with a massive four-poster bed draped in silk hangings. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and utterly foreign. Sebastian stood in the doorway, maintaining that careful distance. He told me that dinner would be served in an hour, that Mrs. Davies would send a maid to help me dress and unpack, that I should rest after the long journey. Then he added, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, that he hoped I would be happy here, that he would do everything in his power to ensure my comfort, that I should never hesitate to ask for anything I needed. The sincerity in his voice made my throat tight. I thanked him, my own voice barely above a whisper, and he bowed, actually bowed to me, his wife, and left, closing the door softly behind him. I stood alone in my beautiful prison, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor, and finally allowed the tears I had been holding back all day to fall. That night, I dined with my husband in a formal dining room far too large for 2 people. We sat at opposite ends of an absurdly long table, making conversation that was polite and utterly meaningless. He asked about my journey comfort. I inquired about the estate management. We discussed the weather, the gardens, the local village. We could have been distant acquaintances at a tedious dinner party rather than a newly married couple on their wedding night. When the meal concluded, Sebastian escorted me back to my chambers, wished me a good night with that same careful courtesy, and disappeared into his own rooms. I heard no sound from the connecting door. He had meant what he said. This was to be a marriage of convenience only, with all the distance and formality that implied. I should have been relieved. Instead, as I lay alone in that enormous bed in my beautiful new prison, I felt a loneliness so acute it was almost physical pain. And still, in the darkness, I could not shake the feeling that I knew those storm-gray eyes from somewhere, that I had seen that face before, in a different context, a different time. The memory danced just out of reach, taunting me with its nearness and its elusiveness. Who was Sebastian Thorne, really? And why did it matter so much to me to know? The first weeks of my marriage passed in a strange sort of limbo, where I existed in luxury and comfort, yet felt perpetually suspended between 2 worlds, the life I had left behind and whatever this new existence was meant to become. Ashworth Manor revealed itself to be even more magnificent than my first impression suggested, with rooms upon rooms filled with treasures accumulated over generations, gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly, and a library that took my breath away the first time Mrs. Davies showed it to me. The library became my sanctuary almost immediately. It occupied an entire wing of the manor, 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with volumes on every conceivable subject. Tall windows let in streams of natural light, and there were numerous reading nooks with comfortable chairs positioned to take advantage of the best illumination. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, and I could easily imagine spending winter evenings curled before it with a book and a cup of tea. Sebastian had mentioned the library during my tour on that first evening, and I had seen something flicker in his eyes when he noted my obvious delight. He told me I should consider it entirely my domain, that I was free to read anything I wished, to rearrange things to my preference, to treat it as my own personal refuge. The generosity of the offer, and the understanding behind it, had touched me more than I wanted to admit. True to his word about maintaining distance, my husband kept largely to his own schedule in those early weeks. We breakfasted together most mornings, his concession to maintaining appearances before the servants, but the meals were quiet affairs marked by polite conversation and careful courtesy. He would inquire about my plans for the day, ensure I had everything I needed, and then excuse himself to attend to estate business or correspondence. We dined together in the evenings in that absurdly formal dining room, and occasionally took tea together in the afternoon if our paths happened to cross. Yet despite this distance, I found evidence of his attention everywhere. Fresh flowers appeared daily in my chambers, always varieties I particularly loved, though I could not recall mentioning my preferences to anyone. The library acquired new volumes with suspicious regularity, and they were always books I had been hoping to find. My favorite blend of tea, a slightly unusual mixture with bergamot that I had grown fond of years ago, materialized in the morning room without my having to request it. Small considerations, carefully arranged, as if someone was paying very close attention indeed to my habits and preferences. It was both touching and deeply confusing. Why would a man who married me purely as a business transaction take such care with these small details? Why maintain such careful distance while simultaneously orchestrating these quiet demonstrations of, what, consideration? Something more? I found myself watching him, studying him when I thought he was not looking, trying to understand the contradiction he presented. In company, the few times we had received or paid social calls to neighboring families, he was the perfect gentleman, attentive without being possessive, clearly proud to present me as his countess. But in private, that careful wall remained firmly in place, as if he feared what might happen if it ever came down. And always, there was that maddening sense of familiarity. Sometimes I would catch him at a certain angle, or hear him laugh at something, rare but devastating when it happened, or see him lost in thought while gazing out a window, and my heart would stutter with the certainty that I knew him. But the memory remained frustratingly out of reach, like trying to recall a dream upon waking. It was during my 3rd week at Ashworth Manor that I made the discovery that would begin to unravel everything. I had been exploring the library systematically, familiarizing myself with its organization and the breadth of its collection. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the light turns silvery, and the sound of drops against windows creates a soothing rhythm. I had gravitated toward the poetry section, running my fingers along the spines of volumes both familiar and unknown. That was when I noticed it. A slim volume bound in dark green leather, positioned not on the main shelves, but on a small table beside what appeared to be Sebastian's preferred reading chair. The positioning suggested a book in current use, one being actively read, rather than merely shelved. Curious, I picked it up, noting the worn condition of the binding that spoke of frequent handling and great age. The sonnets of lost love, read the faded gold lettering on the spine. My heart simply stopped beating for a moment as I stared at that title, feeling recognition slam into me like a physical blow. I knew this book. I had owned a copy once, years ago. A specific copy that I had treasured and then lost in circumstances I could barely remember through the sudden rushing in my ears. With shaking hands, I opened the cover. The title page bore an inscription in elegant script. To E.H., who taught me that poetry lives in moments, not merely in words. Summer, 1814. E.H. Eloise Hartwell, my initials, and the date, 1814. The summer I had turned 17, the summer I had spent in Bath while my parents took the waters, and I had been granted unusual freedom to explore the town and countryside. The summer I had fallen hopelessly, completely, devastatingly in love for the first and only time in my life. The memories came flooding back with such intensity I had to sit down, clutching the book to my chest as the past reassembled itself in my mind. Bath, with its golden stone buildings and fashionable society. The unusual heat that summer, making everyone languid and slightly reckless. The family who had taken the house next to ours, with their bookish son in need of tutoring and the young man they had hired to provide it. Mr. Thorne. That was the name he had gone by. Simply Mr. Thorne. No first name. No title. Just a young man of perhaps 22 or 23 who had come to Bath seeking employment and had been engaged to tutor the son of our neighbors in Latin and Greek. I remembered seeing him for the first time in the gardens that separated our properties, his dark hair falling over his forehead as he bent over a book, reading with such intense concentration that he did not notice me until I was nearly upon him. We had spoken that first day about what he was reading, Ovid, in the original Latin, and he had seemed surprised and delighted when I recognized the passage. It had been the beginning of the most magical summer of my young life. We had met every day, at first by apparent accident and then by obvious design, in those gardens or walking the hills outside Bath or in the lending library, where I would find him browsing the shelves. He had made me laugh with his wry observations about society. He had challenged my thinking on philosophy and literature. He had recited poetry to me in languages both familiar and foreign, his voice turning the words into music. And I, sheltered and romantic and 17, had fallen utterly and completely in love with him. I remembered giving him this book, purchased with my carefully saved pin money, after he had mentioned wanting to read this particular collection. I remembered how his hands had trembled slightly when he accepted it, how he had looked at me with such intensity that I had felt heat rise in my cheeks. I remembered the inscription he had requested I write, and how my hand had shaken as I penned those words. And I remembered, with crystal clarity now, the last time I had seen him. Late August, with autumn's first hints cooling the air. He had found me in our usual meeting spot and told me, his voice rough with some emotion I did not understand, that he had to leave Bath immediately. Family obligations, he said. Circumstances beyond his control. He could not explain, could not give me any address where I might write, could only ask, his voice breaking, that I not think too badly of him for disappearing. I had been heartbroken, devastated, convinced he had simply tired of our friendship, or had been playing with my feelings all along. I had cried for weeks after returning to Hampshire, had written terrible poetry in my journal, had sworn never to trust my heart to anyone again, and eventually, as one does, I had buried the pain, relegated that summer to the category of youthful foolishness, and moved on with my life. But I had never forgotten him, never forgotten the way he made me feel, the way he looked at me, the sound of his laugh, the warmth of his hand, when it accidentally brushed mine during one of our walks. He had been my first love, and in many ways my only love, though I had convinced myself over the years that it had been nothing more than a girl's fantasy. Now, sitting in the library of Ashworth Manor, holding this book with its damning inscription, I finally understood why my husband seemed so familiar, why those storm-gray eyes haunted me, why every gesture, every expression, every fleeting smile tugged at memories I could not quite grasp. Sebastian Thorne was Mr. Thorne, the tutor from Bath, the man I had loved at 17, the man who had broken my heart with his unexplained departure. He had known. From the moment he proposed marriage, perhaps from long before that, he had known exactly who I was, and he had said nothing. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the book. Emotions warred within me, shock, recognition, joy, and underneath it all, a growing anger. He had known me. He had married me knowing our history, knowing what we had once been to each other, and he had maintained this facade of strangers for weeks. Why? What possible reason could he have for such deception? I turned the pages with trembling fingers, and what I found made my breath catch. Throughout the book, in margins and on blank pages, were notes in handwriting I now recognized as Sebastian's. Dates, locations, brief phrases that seemed to be memories or observations. I saw Hampshire, June 1820, saw her from a distance at a country assembly. She did not notice me. And London, March 1822, learned of her family's withdrawal from society, inquired discreetly, but could obtain no direct news. And dozens more, spanning years, chronicling what appeared to be a careful, distant tracking of my life after that summer in Bath. The most recent entry, dated just 2 months before our wedding, simply read, "I will have one more chance. I must not waste it." I closed the book with shaking hands and sat in stunned silence as rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. My husband, the stranger I had been forced to marry, was the love of my youth, the man who had occupied my dreams, and then my regrets for years. And he had orchestrated this marriage knowing exactly who I was, while allowing me to believe we were strangers. The hurt of it was almost physical. The deception, the manipulation, even if the underlying motivation remained unclear. He had let me stand in my father's study and accept a marriage to a stranger when all along I was binding myself to someone I had once loved desperately. Why would he do such a thing? What game was he playing? I needed answers, deserved them. But even as anger surged through me, other feelings complicated the picture. Because now that I knew, now that I could see clearly who he was, other things made sudden, perfect sense. The way he knew my preferences without asking. His careful distance, as if afraid to presume on a connection I did not remember. Those looks of longing and regret I had caught in unguarded moments. He had been protecting himself, protecting his heart from the rejection he perhaps assumed would come if I knew who he really was, and remembered how he had left me. The realization softened something in my chest, even as questions multiplied in my mind. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside the library, the measured tread that I had learned to recognize as Sebastian's. Without thinking, I slipped the book behind a cushion and rose from the chair, trying to compose my features into some semblance of normalcy. I was not ready to confront him yet, not when my emotions were in such turmoil, not when I did not understand the full picture of what was happening between us. He appeared in the doorway, elegant as always in dark trousers and a deep blue waistcoat, that somehow made his eyes appear even more gray. When he saw me, that small, sad smile I had come to know touched his lips. He asked if I was enjoying the library, if I had found anything interesting to read. His voice was carefully neutral, betraying nothing. But now that I knew what to look for, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched slightly at his sides, the intensity with which he watched for my reaction. I managed to respond with appropriate pleasantness, mentioning that I was merely browsing, enjoying the collection. I could see the relief that flickered across his features, quickly suppressed. He lingered a moment longer, seeming to want to say something more, then thought better of it and excused himself with a slight bow. After he left, I retrieved the book and held it against my chest, feeling my heart race. Everything had changed in the space of an afternoon. I now knew who my husband really was, even if I did not yet understand why he had chosen this peculiar path back into my life. And I realized, with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, that the careful distance between us was about to shatter, because I could not unknow what I now knew, could not pretend to be strangers with the man who had been my first love. The question was, what would I do with this knowledge? Confront him immediately? Wait to see if he would reveal himself? And perhaps most frightening of all, what did it mean that knowing who he was made my heart race and my breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with feelings I thought I had buried years ago? That night at dinner, I watched my husband across that ridiculously long table with new eyes. Every gesture, every expression, every word took on new meaning, now that I could see the boy I had loved in the man he had become. He had grown into his features, gained confidence and bearing that came with title and responsibility, but the essential core of him remained. The intelligence in his eyes, the slight quirk of his lips when something amused him, the way his hands moved when he spoke, all achingly familiar now that I knew to look. And I wondered, with increasing urgency, what his plan was. How long did he intend to maintain this charade? What was he waiting for? And most pressingly, did he still feel anything for me beyond whatever guilt or obligation had driven him to marry me? The answers, I suspected, would reshape everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my future, and I found myself both dreading and desperately anticipating the moment when all the careful pretense between us would finally crumble. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in my enormous bed, staring at the canopy above me while memories of that summer in Bath played through my mind with vivid clarity, no longer suppressed by years of willful forgetting. Now that I had identified Sebastian as the young tutor who had captured my 17-year-old heart, I could not stop the flood of recollections, each one adding another piece to the puzzle of who my husband truly was, and what our forced marriage might really mean. I remembered the first time we spoke, truly spoke, beyond mere pleasantries. It had been in the gardens that separated our rented houses, on a morning so beautiful it seemed to shimmer with possibility. I had been reading under my favorite tree, a romance novel I was slightly embarrassed to be caught with, when I heard his voice asking if the book was any good. I had looked up to find him standing a respectful distance away, holding his own book, something far more intellectual, naturally, with an expression of genuine curiosity, rather than the mockery I might have expected from a young man discovering a silly girl with her romantic fiction. I remembered how I had blushed, admitting that the book was perhaps not great literature, but it entertained me nonetheless. And his response, delivered with that slight smile that made my heart flutter even then, that entertainment was perhaps the highest purpose literature could serve, and anyone who claimed otherwise was taking themselves far too seriously. We had talked for an hour that morning, our conversation ranging from books to philosophy to the absurdities of Bath society. He had a way of listening, truly listening, that made me feel as though my thoughts and opinions mattered, as though I was someone worth paying attention to rather than merely a young woman to be tolerated or dismissed. In a world where men rarely took women's intellect seriously, his respect for my mind was intoxicating. After that first conversation, we had seemed to encounter each other everywhere, morning walks that coincidentally followed the same paths, afternoons in the lending library where we would recommend books to one another, evening strolls where we would discuss philosophy and poetry while carefully maintaining the proper distance required by society's rules. My parents, distracted by my father's health treatments and my mother's social activities, paid little attention to my comings and goings, granting me a freedom I had never experienced before and would never have again. I remembered how he had made me laugh. His observations about the pretensions of Bath society were wickedly accurate and delivered with such deadpan seriousness that I would find myself giggling helplessly while he maintained that innocent expression. He had a gift for seeing through artifice and pretension, for identifying the absurdities that everyone else politely ignored. But it was not just laughter he had given me. He had challenged me intellectually in ways no one ever had. He would present philosophical arguments for me to dissect, recommend complex texts, and then discuss them with me as an equal, encourage me to develop and defend my own ideas, rather than simply accepting received wisdom. For a girl who had been educated primarily in accomplishments, meant to make her an attractive marriage prospect. His respect for my mind was revolutionary. I remembered the day I had given him the book, that slim volume of poetry now hidden in my chambers like evidence of a crime. We had been walking on the hills outside Bath, far enough from town to feel almost alone in the world, and he had mentioned wanting to read that particular collection, but being unable to afford it on his meager salary as a tutor. The vulnerability in that admission, the brief glimpse of his financial struggles, had touched something deep in my chest. I had used my carefully hoarded pin money to purchase the volume the next day, and when I presented it to him, I saw his face transform with an emotion so intense it had stolen my breath. He had tried to refuse, saying it was too generous, too fine a gift, but I had insisted, asking him to write an inscription that would make it truly mine to give. His hands had trembled as he penned those words. To E.H., who taught me that poetry lives in moments, not merely in words. At the time, I had thought it merely a lovely sentiment. Now, years later, I understood it as the confession it truly was. He had been trying to tell me, in the only way he could, that his feelings transcended the boundaries of our situation. The memories came faster now, tumbling over one another in no particular order. An afternoon when we had been caught in a sudden rainstorm and taken shelter in a small folly, laughing as we shook water from our clothes and hair, the air between us charged with something neither of us dared name. An evening when he had read Petrarch to me in Italian, his voice turning the words into music, and I had felt tears prick my eyes at the beauty of it. A morning when our hands had brushed while reaching for the same book in the library, and we had both frozen, the contact lasting only seconds, but searing itself into my memory. I had known I was falling in love with him. Even at 17, even with my limited experience, I had recognized the feeling for what it was. Every morning I woke thinking of him. Every conversation we had, I memorized and replayed later. Every accidental touch sent electricity through my veins. I had written terrible, overwrought poetry in my journal, comparing him to Byron's heroes, and convinced that no one in the history of the world had ever felt what I felt, and I had believed, with the naive certainty of youth, that he felt the same. There were moments when I caught him looking at me with such intensity that I could barely breathe. Times when his voice would roughen when speaking to me, or when he would move slightly closer than strict propriety allowed. Once, when I had stumbled on an uneven path, he had caught me, and for a heartbeat, we had stood with his arms around me, his face inches from mine, and I had seen something in his eyes that looked like longing and regret and hope all mixed together. But he had never spoken of his feelings, never crossed the line from friendship to courtship, and I, bound by the constraints of being a gently bred young woman, could not be the one to broach such a subject. So we had continued our careful dance through that golden summer, neither of us acknowledging what was building between us with each passing day, until that afternoon in late August, when everything had shattered. I could see it now with painful clarity, the way he had been waiting for me in our usual meeting spot, his face grave, his hands clenched at his sides. Before I could even greet him properly, he had told me he was leaving Bath immediately, that very evening, in fact. There was no time for proper goodbyes, no possibility of future correspondence, no explanation beyond vague references to family obligations and circumstances beyond his control. I had been devastated, confused, angry. I had asked him why, begged for a better explanation, demanded to know if I had done something wrong, and he had simply stood there, his face a mask of control except for his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had looked at me with such pain that I had felt it echo in my own chest. He had told me, his voice breaking slightly, that I should not think badly of him. That our time together had meant more to him than I could possibly know, that he would carry the memory of that summer with him always. Then, before I could respond, or even process what he was saying, he had turned and walked away, his stride quick and almost desperate, as if remaining a moment longer would destroy his resolve entirely. I had stood in that garden, watching him disappear, feeling as though my heart was being torn from my chest. I had waited there for hours, hoping irrationally that he would return, that there had been some mistake, that he would explain everything, and we could return to how things had been. But he never came back. By the next morning, his employer informed my mother that Mr. Thorne had left Bath unexpectedly and would not be returning. I had returned to Hampshire a week later when the season ended, hollow and heartbroken in a way that seemed ridiculously dramatic for what had been technically only a friendship. But it had felt like so much more than friendship. It had felt like losing a part of myself I would never get back. Over the following years, I had tried to forget him, had convinced myself that it had been nothing but a summer flirtation, that I had read too much into simple kindness, that my romantic imagination had inflated a pleasant acquaintance into something it never truly was. I had filed him away in my memory as a lesson learned about the dangers of allowing feelings to run away with sense, but I had never fallen in love again, had never felt that spark with any of the few men who had shown interest in me during our family's increasingly rare forays into society. Some part of me, I realized now, had been measuring every man against the memory of Mr. Thorne and finding them all wanting, and now that young tutor was my husband. Sebastian Thorne, Earl of Ashworth, the stranger I had been forced to marry, was the same man who had captured my heart 8 years ago, and left me to wonder forever what might have been. The questions multiplied in my mind as I lay sleepless in the darkness. Why had he left so suddenly that summer? Where had he gone? How had a tutor of apparently modest means become an earl? And most pressingly, why had he married me this way, knowing our history, instead of simply revealing himself and courting me properly? I thought about all the small kindnesses since our marriage, the flowers he knew I loved, the books he somehow knew I wanted to read, the tea blend I had mentioned preferring once, 8 years ago, now appearing magically in my morning room. He had been paying attention to me all this time, tracking my life from a distance, remembering every detail I had ever shared with him. The realization made my chest tight with confused emotion. It spoke of devotion, certainly, but also of a kind of patient obsession that was both flattering and slightly unsettling. What did it mean that he had watched me from afar for 8 years? What had he been waiting for? And why, when he finally acted, had he chosen this method, a forced marriage born of my family's desperation, rather than an honest courtship built on our shared past? There were only 2 possible explanations I could conceive. Either he doubted that I would accept him if I knew the truth of who he was, perhaps assuming I harbored resentment over his abandonment, or there was some secret, some hidden reason for his actions that I could not yet see. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. As dawn began to paint my windows with pale light, I finally admitted to myself the most frightening truth of all. Despite the confusion, despite the justified anger at his deception, despite all the unanswered questions, I was still drawn to him, perhaps even more powerfully now than I had been at 17, because the man he had become combined all the qualities I had loved in the young tutor with a maturity and depth that made him even more compelling. Watching him across the dinner table last night, seeing him move through the manor with quiet confidence, remembering the care he took with my comfort, despite maintaining his careful distance, all of it called to something deep in my chest. The feelings I thought I had buried years ago were not gone at all. They had merely been waiting, dormant, for the right catalyst to bring them roaring back to life. I rose with the sun, knowing I could not continue as I had been. The careful pretense between Sebastian and me had been built on my ignorance, and that foundation had now crumbled entirely. I could not unknow what I knew, could not pretend to be strangers with the man who had been my first love, but I also could not simply confront him without understanding more. I needed to know why he had left Bath so suddenly, what had happened in the intervening years to transform a struggling tutor into a wealthy earl, and most importantly, what he felt for me now, beyond whatever guilt or obligation had driven him to marry me. As I dressed and prepared to face another day of careful formality, I made a decision. I would watch him, study him with the knowledge I now possessed, look for clues to his motivations and feelings in the small moments when his guard might slip. And when I finally did confront him, When I revealed that I knew exactly who he was, I would have enough information to understand the full truth of our situation. The game, if it could be called such a thing, had changed entirely. We were no longer a stranger husband and wife maintaining polite distance. We were two people with a shared past and uncertain present, both hiding behind careful masks, both afraid of what might happen if those masks finally fell away. And I found myself both dreading and desperately anticipating the moment when all our carefully maintained pretenses would finally shatter and we would have to face each other and ourselves with complete honesty. Whatever happened next, I knew my life would never be the same. The question was whether the truth, when it finally emerged, would destroy us both or give us a second chance at something we had lost 8 years ago. The days following my discovery in the library were a peculiar form of torture. I found myself hyper-aware of Sebastian's every movement, every word, every glance, searching for confirmation of what I now knew while simultaneously trying to maintain the facade of ignorance. It was exhausting, this dual consciousness. The part of me that was the bewildered new bride trying to adjust to her circumstances, and the part that was the woman who had once loved this man desperately and was struggling to understand what that meant now. I caught myself watching him at breakfast, studying the way his long fingers wrapped around his coffee cup, remembering how those same hands had once trembled when accepting the book of poetry I had given him. At dinner, I found my attention drawn to his profile as he read correspondence beside his plate, seeing in the mature planes of his face the ghost of the younger man who had made my 17-year-old heart race. And in the few moments when we happened to be in the same room, the library, the morning room, passing in corridors, I felt an electricity in the air that surely he must sense as well. If he noticed my increased scrutiny, he gave no sign. He maintained his careful courtesy, his respectful distance, his small gestures of consideration that now seemed laden with meaning I had not recognized before. But I began to notice things I had missed in my initial confusion about our marriage. The way his gaze would linger on me when he thought I was not looking, with an expression of such longing it made my breath catch. The slight tension in his shoulders whenever we were in proximity, as if he was holding himself rigidly in check. The careful way he always maintained physical distance between us, never allowing even accidental contact, as though he did not trust what might happen if that barrier broke down. He was not indifferent. Whatever else was true, Sebastian was not indifferent to me. The realization sent heat flooding through my veins and made my heart race in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. 2 weeks after my discovery, an invitation arrived that would change everything. Lord and Lady Pemberton, our nearest neighbors of consequence, were hosting a summer ball at their estate. It was to be a grand affair, the first major social event of the season in our corner of Somerset, and attendance was essentially mandatory for anyone of rank. As the new Countess of Ashworth, I would be making my first formal appearance in local society. Sebastian brought me the invitation at breakfast, and I saw something flicker in his eyes as he handed it to me. Nervousness, perhaps, or anticipation. He mentioned that there would be dancing, asked if I was comfortable with the prospect, offered to arrange for a dressmaker from London if I wished for a new gown for the occasion. His solicitude was genuine, but I could hear the tension underlying his words. I accepted, of course. What choice did I have? And truthfully, some reckless part of me wanted to see what would happen when we were forced into closer proximity than our careful distance usually allowed. A ball meant dancing. Dancing meant his hands on me, our bodies moving together in ways our daily existence carefully avoided. The prospect made my pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with social anxiety and everything to do with the memories flooding my mind. The evening of the ball arrived with surprising swiftness. I dressed with more care than usual, choosing a gown of deep sapphire silk that my maid assured me complemented my coloring beautifully. The neckline was perhaps more daring than what I typically wore, the cut more fashionable, and when I studied myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the sophisticated woman staring back at me. I looked like a countess. I looked like someone Sebastian Thorne might actually want as his wife, rather than merely a convenient solution to my family's financial problems. When I descended the stairs to where Sebastian waited in the entrance hall, I saw him freeze, his eyes widening fractionally as he took in my appearance. For a long moment, he simply stared, and I watched his throat work as he swallowed hard. Then he recovered his composure, but not before I had seen the raw appreciation, and something deeper, something almost desperate, flash across his features. He told me I looked beautiful, his voice rougher than usual, and offered his arm to escort me to the carriage. When I placed my hand on his sleeve, I felt him tense beneath my touch, a minute tremor running through him that he quickly suppressed. The contact, even through layers of fabric, sent electricity arcing between us, and I knew, absolutely knew, that he felt it too. The drive to Pemberton Hall was silent, charged with an awareness we could not acknowledge. In the darkness of the carriage, I could feel his gaze on me, burning with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Once our knees brushed accidentally as the carriage hit a rut in the road, and I heard his sharp intake of breath, saw his hands clench briefly before he deliberately shifted away, maintaining that careful distance that had become both refuge and prison for us both. Pemberton Hall was ablaze with light when we arrived, music spilling from the open windows, the carriageway crowded with the vehicles of what seemed like half the county. As we entered, I felt Sebastian's hand settle possessively at the small of my back, the first time he had touched me so intimately since our wedding day, and the heat of his palm through the thin silk of my gown made me shiver. We were announced, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward us. The new Earl and Countess of Ashworth, objects of intense curiosity and speculation. Sebastian guided me through the initial greetings with practiced ease, introducing me to what seemed like an endless stream of local gentry, his hand never leaving the small of my back, his presence at my side steady and somehow reassuring, despite the confusion of my feelings. The evening progressed with the usual pattern of such events: conversation, refreshments, more introductions, the careful navigation of social hierarchies and expectations. Through it all, I remained acutely conscious of Sebastian beside me, the heat of him, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his attention never truly left me even when he was engaged in conversation with others. Then came the dancing. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and I felt Sebastian's hand tighten almost imperceptibly against my back. He leaned down, his lips close to my ear, and asked in a voice that sent shivers down my spine if I would honor him with the first dance. The formal phrasing could not disguise the tension in his words, the question beneath the question. I agreed, of course. As his wife, it was expected. But as he led me onto the dance floor and turned to face me, placing one hand at my waist and taking my hand in his, I felt the world narrow to just the two of us. His hand was warm through my glove, his fingers strong and sure as they clasped mine. His other hand at my waist burned like a brand, and suddenly the carefully maintained distance between us collapsed under the weight of proximity and memory, and 8 years of unspoken longing. We began to move, and it was as if no time had passed at all. He moved with the same natural grace I remembered, leading me effortlessly through the steps, but there was a new confidence to his movements, a sureness that came with maturity and experience. And the way he held me, just barely within the bounds of propriety, but with an intensity that suggested he wanted to pull me much closer, made my heart race and my breath come short. I looked up and found him watching me with those storm-gray eyes, and in them I saw everything he had been so carefully hiding: longing, regret, hope, and underneath it all, a hunger that made heat pool low in my stomach. This close, there was no hiding behind careful courtesy or formal distance. This close, the truth of what existed between us was undeniable. The music swirled around us, and we moved as if we had danced together 1,000 times before. In a way, perhaps we had. In that summer in Bath, we had moved in our own kind of dance, careful steps maintaining proper distance while every glance and word pulled us closer. This was simply a different choreography for the same fundamental tension. And then he spoke, his voice pitched low so only I could hear, and the words he chose shattered the last pretense between us. He mentioned the stars in Bath, how they had seemed brighter that summer, how he had thought of them often over the years, wondering if I remembered too. The comment was so specific, so clearly referencing our past, that there could be no doubt he knew exactly what he was revealing. It was a test, perhaps, or maybe simply a crack in his carefully maintained facade. But it was deliberate, and it changed everything. My feet stumbled slightly, and his hand tightened at my waist, steadying me while his eyes searched my face with sudden intensity. He knew I had recognized the reference, could see in my expression that the secret he had been keeping was secret no longer. And in that moment, With the music playing around us and dozens of people watching, the careful distance we had maintained for weeks collapsed entirely. I saw panic flash across his features, quickly followed by resignation and something that looked almost like relief. His carefully constructed pretense had crumbled, and now we would both have to face the consequences. When the dance ended and he escorted me from the floor, his hand trembled slightly against mine. He suggested, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, that we take some air. I agreed, my own voice not entirely steady, and he guided me through the crush of people toward the terrace doors. Outside, the night was cool and clear, stars brilliant overhead in a way that did indeed remind me of Bath. We walked in silence to the far end of the terrace, away from other guests who had also sought the cooler air. When we finally stopped, standing at the balustrade overlooking the darkened gardens, I felt him turn to face me, and I could sense the tension radiating from him. He spoke my name, Eloise, just my name, but with such weight of feeling that it made my eyes sting with unexpected tears. Then, haltingly at first but with increasing urgency, the whole story began to pour out. He told me he had known who I was when he proposed marriage, had known, in fact, long before that, because he had never forgotten me, never stopped thinking about that summer in Bath, when he had fallen hopelessly in love with a girl he could not have. His departure had not been choice but necessity. His uncle, the previous Earl of Ashworth, had fallen gravely ill and summoned Sebastian urgently to the continent. The uncle had no other heirs, and Sebastian, though he had been using a different name and concealing his connection to the family to avoid the complications that came with being recognized as the Earl's nephew, had been forced to assume responsibilities he was not prepared for. He spoke of years spent rebuilding the family fortune, which his uncle had nearly destroyed through bad investments and worse judgment, of establishing himself as a worthy earl rather than the struggling young man who had been forced to work as a tutor to help pay family debts, of searching for me once he was finally secure enough to offer me a life worthy of what he felt I deserved. But by the time he was ready, my family had withdrawn from society, and he could not find me. When he finally learned of my father's gambling debts and the family's precarious situation, he saw it as a terrible gift, the chance to save me while simultaneously securing the one thing he had wanted for 8 years, my presence in his life. His voice broke as he admitted his cowardice. He should have revealed himself immediately, should have given me the choice of accepting or rejecting him based on our history. But he had been terrified that I would remember him only as the man who abandoned me, that the love I might have felt at 17 had curdled into resentment or indifference. So he had taken the coward's path, marrying me as a stranger while hoping that gradually, carefully, he might earn my affection as the man he had become, rather than risking immediate rejection as the ghost of who he had been. As he spoke, I felt tears streaming down my face, my careful composure completely undone. Everything I had wondered, everything I had feared and hoped, it all crystallized into this moment of complete, devastating honesty. He had loved me then. He loved me now. And his elaborate pretense had been not manipulation, but protection. Of himself, yes, but also of me, giving me time to adjust to our marriage before burdening me with the weight of our shared past. When he finally fell silent, his face turned toward the stars, as if he could not bear to see my reaction. I found my voice at last. I told him, words tumbling over themselves in their urgency, that I had discovered the truth weeks ago, that I had found the book with my inscription, had remembered everything about that summer, had been watching him and wondering when he would finally reveal himself, that I had been furious at the deception, but also confused, because the feelings I thought I had buried years ago had come roaring back to life the moment I understood who he truly was. He turned to stare at me, shock and hope warring in his expression. I saw his hands clench at his sides as if he was physically restraining himself from reaching for me, and in that moment, standing under stars that reminded us both of a summer 8 years past, I finally understood what I wanted, what I had perhaps always wanted, even when I convinced myself I had moved on. I closed the distance between us, my hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath my palms. I told him that he was a fool for thinking I would reject him, that the girl who loved him at 17 had never really stopped, that she had merely been waiting, as he had, for a second chance that seemed impossible until it wasn't. And then, finally, blessedly, his control shattered. His hands came up to frame my face with a gentleness that belied the intensity in his eyes, his thumb brushing away the tears still streaming down my cheeks. He whispered my name like a prayer, like a question, like a plea, and when I answered by rising on my toes and closing the last distance between us, his mouth met mine, with 8 years of longing and regret and desperate hope poured into a single, searing kiss. The world fell away. There was only his lips on mine, his arms pulling me close, the feeling of finally being where I belonged after years of wandering lost. The kiss was tender and hungry, passionate and reverent, all at once. Everything we had denied ourselves for so long pouring out in a single moment of perfect honesty. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against mine and his hand still cupped my face as if I might disappear if he let go. He told me he loved me, had always loved me, would always love me, and the raw honesty in his voice made my heart swell until I thought it might burst. I told him I loved him too, had loved him then, loved him now, would love him always. And I saw in his eyes the exact moment when he finally believed it, when the fear and doubt that had driven all his careful planning finally released their hold, replaced by joy so pure and intense it transformed his entire being. We stood there in the starlight, wrapped in each other's arms, and I felt the weight of weeks of pretense and years of separation finally lift. We still had much to discuss, details to clarify, years of lost time to somehow account for. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was that we had found each other again, that the love we thought lost had merely been waiting, and that the forced marriage that began as obligation had transformed into the second chance neither of us had dared hope for. Eventually, propriety demanded we return to the ballroom, though neither of us wanted to leave the sanctuary of that moment. As we walked back inside, Sebastian's hand firmly clasping mine, I felt irrationally happy, as if I were floating rather than walking. And when I caught sight of us reflected in a window, the way he looked at me, the way I leaned into him, the rightness of our joined hands, I finally understood what I had been too confused to see before. This was not a marriage of convenience. This was not a business transaction or a forced arrangement. This was a love story 8 years in the making, and it was only just beginning. We did not return to the ballroom immediately. Instead, Sebastian guided me deeper into the gardens, away from the house and its lights and curious eyes, toward a small gazebo barely visible in the moonlight. His hand gripped mine as if he feared I might vanish, and I found myself holding just as tightly, anchoring him to me in turn. Inside the gazebo, partially hidden by climbing roses that perfumed the air with their sweet scent, we finally had the privacy we desperately needed. The music from the ballroom was a distant accompaniment, and the moonlight filtering through the latticework created patterns of shadow and silver across Sebastian's face, as he turned to look at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Now that the barrier between us had finally shattered, words seemed to tumble from him with an urgency born of 8 years of enforced silence. He wanted me to understand everything, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not just the bare facts he had already revealed, but the whole truth of what had happened and why. He told me of that terrible afternoon when the letter arrived summoning him back to his uncle, how he had been in the middle of planning how to speak to my father, how to somehow make himself worthy of courting me despite his lack of fortune and prospects. The letter had destroyed everything in a single moment. His uncle was dying, the family fortune was in ruins, and Sebastian was the only heir. He had to leave immediately, that very evening, to have any hope of salvaging the estate and the title that would fall to him. His voice broke as he described standing in that garden in Bath, knowing he had to say goodbye, but unable to explain why. How could he tell me the truth? That he was not simply Mr. Thorne, humble tutor, but Sebastian Thorne, nephew to an earl, soon to inherit a title and an estate drowning in debt? That even if he wanted to court me properly, he had nothing to offer but years of struggle and uncertainty? He had been 23, barely more than a boy himself, despite his pretensions to maturity, and he had made what he thought was the noble choice, to disappear rather than ask me to wait for a future that might never materialize. I felt anger flare at that, hot and sharp. I told him he should have trusted me with the truth, should have given me the choice, rather than making it for me. His assumption that I would not wait, would not want him without fortune or prospects, had hurt me more than any financial struggle could have. I would have waited, I said fiercely, would have written to him, would have helped however I could, would have been there through all of it if only he had asked. He closed his eyes, pain etched across his features, and admitted that he knew that now. But at 23, proud and foolish and convinced that love required more than just feeling to be sustainable, he had made the wrong choice, a choice he had regretted every day since. The years that followed, he told me, had been the longest of his life. His uncle had died within weeks of Sebastian's arrival on the continent, leaving him with a title, a crumbling estate, and debts that seemed insurmountable. He had spent 2 years simply trying to understand the extent of the disaster, working with solicitors and estate managers to piece together some path forward. Then 3 more years slowly, painstakingly rebuilding, investing carefully, making connections, leveraging the title he had never wanted to restore the fortune that should have accompanied it. Through all of it, I had been his constant thought. He told me of sleepless nights when he would remember our conversations, our walks, the way I laughed at his observations about society, of mornings when he would wake thinking of me and have to forcibly remind himself that I was lost to him, that by the time he was worthy of offering for me, I would surely be married to someone else, some man who had been smart enough to recognize my worth and secure enough to claim it. He had tried to move on, had told himself repeatedly that he needed to forget me and find someone suitable to be his countess. But every woman he met seemed lacking when measured against my memory. None of them had my intelligence, my wit, my ability to see through pretense to truth. None of them made him want to be better, to achieve more, simply to be worthy of standing beside them. By the time he finally returned to England 2 years ago, the estate restored and his position secure, finding me had become an obsession. He had gone to London first, making discreet inquiries, only to learn that the Hartwell family had withdrawn from society years earlier. Further investigation had revealed rumors of financial difficulties and scandal, but no one seemed to know the current whereabouts or circumstances of the family. It had taken him 6 more months of searching, hiring investigators, following cold trails before he finally located our estate in Hampshire. By then, he said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, he was nearly desperate. The fear that I might already be married, that I might be unhappy, that he might have lost his chance forever, it had consumed him. When he learned of my father's gambling debts, the precariousness of our situation, and most importantly that I remained unmarried, he had seen it as both a gift and a curse. A gift because it meant I was not lost to him forever. A curse because it meant approaching me through the most mercenary of means, using my family's desperation to secure what he wanted most in the world. He had agonized over the decision, he told me, had considered revealing himself, approaching my father with an honest courtship proposal rather than a business transaction. But fear had won out. Fear that I would remember him only as the man who abandoned me. Fear that I would reject him out of lingering hurt or simple indifference born of time past. So he had chosen the coward's path, marrying me as a stranger while hoping that somehow, gradually, he could make me care for him again as the man he had become. The weeks of our marriage, maintaining that careful distance while watching me slowly settle into Ashworth Manor, had been exquisite torture. Every time he saw me smile at something in the library, every time he learned of a new preference or habit to accommodate, every time he caught himself staring at me across the dinner table, it all reinforced both his love and his cowardice. He wanted desperately to tell me the truth, to remind me of Bath and gauge whether any of those feelings remained. But the fear of rejection, of seeing recognition dawn in my eyes followed by hurt or anger, or worst of all indifference, had kept him silent. When I told him, my voice shaking with emotion, about finding the book in the library and the rush of memories that had followed, I saw relief and regret war across his features. He had left the book there deliberately, he admitted. Part of him had hoped I would find it, would make the connection, would confront him and force his hand. But when days passed and I said nothing, he had convinced himself I either had not seen it or did not remember. I explained my own confusion, the recognition that had flickered just out of reach since our first meeting, finally crystallizing when I held that volume and read my own inscription. I told him of the anger I had felt at his deception, but also of the understanding that had slowly grown as I watched him, and saw in his careful courtesy, not manipulation, but protection. Of both of us. His hands came up to frame my face again, his thumbs brushing across my cheekbones as if memorizing their contours. He told me he was sorry, so deeply sorry for all of it, for leaving Bath without explanation, for the years of silence, for marrying me under false pretenses, for not trusting me with the truth from the beginning. His voice broke on the words, and I saw tears glinting in his eyes. This proud, careful man finally allowing himself to be vulnerable. I covered his hands with mine, holding them against my face, and told him I forgave him, for all of it, because I understood now what had driven every decision, misguided though some of them might have been. He had loved me enough to let me go when he thought he had nothing to offer, had worked for years to become someone worthy of me, had found a way to save my family and secure my future even if it meant I might never return his feelings. Every choice, however flawed, had been rooted in love and the desire to protect me. The relief that flooded his features made him look years younger. He pulled me against him, his arms wrapping around me so tightly I could barely breathe, his face buried in my hair, as if he needed to reassure himself I was real and present and his. I felt his chest heave against mine, and realized with shock that he was crying, silent tears that spoke of years of loneliness and longing finally released. I held him just as tightly, my own tears falling freely now. We stood like that for long minutes, two people who had loved and lost, and somehow, impossibly, found each other again, letting years of pain and regret flow out of us into the moonlit night. When we finally pulled apart enough to see each other's faces, we were both smiling through our tears. He told me I was even more beautiful than he remembered, that the girl he had loved had grown into a woman who exceeded every dream he had harbored during our years apart. I told him he was still the same person who had captured my heart at 17, still intelligent, still observant, still able to see me in a way no one else ever had. The title and fortune and years had added depth and maturity, but the essential core of him remained unchanged. He asked me, his voice hesitant despite everything we had just shared, if I truly meant what I said earlier, if I really loved him, if this was not just emotion born of revelation and moonlight that would fade in the harsh light of day. The vulnerability in the question made my heart ache. I answered him the only way I could, by pulling him down to me and kissing him with all the love and longing and certainty I felt. This kiss was different from the first, slower, deeper, a promise rather than a question. His arms tightened around me and I felt him shudder, felt the last of his careful control finally, completely dissolve. When we broke apart, both breathless, I told him that I had never stopped loving him, that the girl who fell for him at 17 had simply been waiting, dormant, for him to come back to her. That I had been falling in love with him again these past weeks, even before I knew who he was, because the essential person I loved had never changed. And now that I knew the full truth, now that there were no more secrets between us, I loved him more than ever, not just for who he was, but for everything he had overcome and sacrificed and endured to find his way back to me. I saw in his eyes, the moment he finally, truly believed me, the last shadow of doubt and fear vanished, replaced by joy so pure and intense, it seemed to radiate from him. He laughed then, a sound of such unbridled happiness it made me laugh too, and suddenly we were both laughing and crying and kissing, giddy with relief and love, and the sheer improbability of our second chance. He told me he had been planning to court me properly, as a husband should, to win my affection slowly and carefully, to make me fall in love with Sebastian Thorne the Earl, rather than demanding I accept him as Mr. Thorne the Tutor, returned from the past. But now that the truth was out, now that I had somehow, miraculously, already forgiven him and loved him despite everything, he wanted to start fresh. No more careful distance, no more polite formality, no more pretending to be strangers bound only by legal obligation. I agreed wholeheartedly, telling him I was tired of sleeping alone in my enormous bed, tired of formal dinners at opposite ends of that ridiculous table, tired of pretending my heart did not race every time he entered a room. I wanted a real marriage, I told him. The marriage we should have had 8 years ago, given the chance to finally flourish. The heat that flared in his eyes at my words made my breath catch. He told me, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register that sent shivers through me, that he had been exercising remarkable restraint these past weeks, that he had wanted nothing more than to cross that threshold between our rooms, to take me in his arms, to show me physically what words could not adequately express, but he had been determined to give me time, to let me adjust, to earn the right to claim me as his wife in truth, rather than just in law. Now, he said, his lips brushing against my temple, my cheek, the corner of my mouth with feather-light kisses that made me tremble. He would very much like to stop exercising that restraint, if I was willing, if I was certain, because once he started, he was not sure he would be able to maintain any distance at all. I answered by pulling him to me again, kissing him with all the pent-up longing of weeks of careful avoidance and years of separation before that. His response was immediate and fierce, his hands sliding into my hair and destroying the careful arrangement, his body pressing against mine as if he wanted to eliminate even the whisper of space between us. Eventually, necessity for air and some vestige of propriety forced us apart. We were still at someone else's ball, still expected to maintain at least minimal decorum, but as Sebastian tucked a loosened curl behind my ear with a tenderness that made my eyes sting, I saw in his expression a promise of continuation once we returned home. We returned to the ballroom hand in hand, and I did not care that it might appear improper, or that my hair was slightly mussed, or that anyone looking closely could probably tell we had been crying. Let them speculate. Let them wonder. I was done with pretense and careful distance, and hiding what I felt. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. We danced again, and this time there was no careful formality, no studied distance. Sebastian held me as close as propriety allowed, and occasionally slightly closer, his eyes never leaving my face, and I felt as if we were the only two people in the room. When we spoke with other guests, his hand remained at my waist or his fingers laced with mine, a constant physical connection that announced to everyone that whatever they had thought about the Earl and Countess of Ashworth, they had been profoundly mistaken. The carriage ride home was nothing like our silent, tension-filled journey to the ball. Sebastian pulled me against his side the moment the door closed, his arm around my shoulders and my head resting against his chest, and we talked, truly talked, for the first time about everything and nothing. Plans for the future, memories of the past, dreams and hopes and all the small details that lovers share and strangers never know. When we finally arrived at Ashworth Manor, Sebastian lifted me from the carriage despite my laughing protests, carrying me up the stairs as if I weighed nothing. The servants who saw us smiled knowingly and discreetly disappeared. He carried me all the way to my chambers, but when he set me down, it was not to say good night and retreat to his own rooms as he had every night since our wedding. Instead, he simply looked at me with a question in his eyes, giving me one last chance to ask for more time if I needed it. But I had wasted enough time, had enough years stolen from us already. I reached up and slowly, deliberately, removed the pins from what remained of my hairstyle, letting my dark curls tumble down around my shoulders. Then I held out my hand to him in invitation. The look of wonder and desire and love that crossed his face made me feel beautiful and wanted and cherished in a way I had never experienced. He took my hand, his fingers threading through mine, and I led him through the door that connected our chambers, the door that had remained locked since our wedding night. It would not be locked again. I woke the morning after the ball to sunlight streaming through windows I had forgotten to curtain the night before, and to the entirely novel sensation of Sebastian's arm wrapped around my waist, his body warm and solid against my back. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, afraid that moving would break the spell, and I would discover this was merely a dream, that I would wake alone in my bed, with the careful distance between us still firmly in place. But then Sebastian stirred behind me, his arm tightening slightly, and I heard his voice, rough with sleep but unmistakably real, murmur my name against my hair. He asked if I was awake, if I was well, if I had any regrets about the previous night. The vulnerability in that last question made my heart clench. I turned in his arms to face him, seeing him sleep-tousled and unguarded in a way I had never witnessed before, and told him the only regret I had was that we had wasted weeks maintaining our careful pretense, when we could have had this all along. The smile that lit his face transformed him completely, making him look young and happy and free, in a way I suspected he had not allowed himself to be in years. We stayed in bed far longer than was proper, talking and laughing and learning each other in ways both intimate and mundane. He told me things I had never known, that he had a scar on his shoulder from a childhood fall, that he could not stand the taste of oysters, despite their fashionable popularity, that he wrote poetry, but destroyed every attempt as inadequate. I shared my own secrets, my terrible singing voice that I hid from everyone, My secret love of Gothic novels I pretended were too frivolous to enjoy. My habit of talking to plants in the garden when I thought no one could hear. These small revelations, silly and inconsequential as many of them were, felt more significant than any grand declaration. We were building intimacy, creating the foundation of true partnership that we should have had the chance to develop 8 years ago. We were, I realized, having the courtship we had been denied, compressed into stolen hours of sunlit morning where the outside world ceased to exist. Eventually, necessity and hunger drove us from our cocoon. Sebastian returned reluctantly to his own chambers to dress, but not before kissing me thoroughly and extracting a promise that we would breakfast together. When my maid arrived to help me dress, she took one look at my face and smiled knowingly, making me blush to the roots of my hair, but also filling me with a warm happiness I could not suppress. Breakfast was an entirely different affair than the formal, silent meals that had marked our first weeks of marriage. We sat adjacent rather than at opposite ends of that ridiculous table, and conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the occasional touch of hands. The servants who attended us wore barely suppressed smiles, clearly delighted by the transformation in their master and mistress. The following weeks unfolded like a dream. Sebastian abandoned all pretense of maintaining separate lives, and we became truly partners in every sense. He showed me the estate management, soliciting my opinions on decisions and seeming genuinely interested in my suggestions. We rode together through the countryside, visited tenants together, entertained guests together, as a united front, rather than two polite strangers playing roles. The nights were revelatory in ways I had not anticipated. Not merely the physical intimacy, though that was extraordinary and growing richer as we learned each other's preferences and desires, but also the simple pleasure of falling asleep in his arms and waking beside him, of late-night conversations in the darkness where we shared thoughts too private or too foolish for daylight, of the profound comfort of not being alone. One evening, perhaps 6 weeks after the ball that changed everything, Sebastian appeared in our shared sitting room carrying a wooden box I had never seen before. His expression was nervous, almost shy, as he set it on the table between us and told me there was something he wanted to show me. Inside the box were letters, hundreds of them, it seemed, all in Sebastian's distinctive handwriting, none of them sealed or addressed. He told me, his voice soft with remembered pain, that these were the letters he had written to me over the years, letters he could never send because he had no address, because he had no right, because he was not yet worthy. But writing them had helped him feel connected to me, had given him a way to share his thoughts and experiences, even if only with the phantom of my memory. With shaking hands, I lifted the first letter from the box. It was dated just 3 months after he had left Bath, written from somewhere in France, and it spoke of his grief over his uncle's death, his overwhelm at the responsibilities suddenly thrust upon him, and his longing for me, for my counsel, my laughter, my presence. I read of his struggles and triumphs, his business ventures and disappointments, his gradual transformation from uncertain young man to confident earl. But threaded through every letter was the constant, his love for me, his determination to become worthy of me, his hope that somehow, someday, he might find his way back to me. I read until tears blurred my vision, and my throat was too tight to continue. Then Sebastian was there, pulling me into his arms, and we held each other while I cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization of how deeply, how constantly he had loved me through all our years apart. I told him I wanted to read them all, every single one, no matter how long it took. These letters were our lost years, the bridge between who we had been and who we had become. And he told me he had saved them, hoping that someday I might want to know, might want to understand the journey he had taken to find his way back to me. Over the following weeks, I read every letter. I learned of his struggles to restore the estate, his careful cultivation of business connections, his strategic investments that slowly rebuilt the family fortune. I read of his returns to England and his desperate searches for me, the disappointment each time a lead went nowhere. I read of other women his friends had tried to match him with, and his complete disinterest in anyone who was not me. And always, his declarations of love and hope and determination that somehow our story was not finished. The letters gave me something precious, a window into the years we had lost, a way to understand not just what he had done, but who he had been throughout our separation. And they confirmed what I had already come to believe, that our love was not a youthful infatuation resurrected by proximity and need, but something deep and enduring that had survived time and distance and circumstance. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn, painting the Ashworth grounds in shades of gold and crimson, I discovered I was with child. The realization came with a mixture of joy and trepidation. Joy at the thought of a child created from our reunited love, trepidation about whether I would be a good mother, whether I was ready for such responsibility. When I told Sebastian, he quite literally swept me off my feet, spinning me around while laughing with delight, before setting me down carefully as if I had suddenly become fragile porcelain. His joy was unrestrained, pure, and as he dropped to his knees and pressed his face against my still flat stomach, I saw tears streaming down his face. He told me, his voice breaking with emotion, that this child was more than he had ever dared hope for. Not just an heir for the title, though that was certainly significant, but proof that our love, tested by separation and reunited against all odds, was creating something new and precious. A family built not on duty or obligation, but on genuine love and partnership. The months of my pregnancy passed in a haze of happiness I had never imagined possible when I sat in my father's study, accepting a marriage to a stranger. Sebastian was attentive to the point of absurdity, worrying over my every discomfort, and insisting I rest far more than was probably necessary. But his concern came from love, and I found I could not resent it even when his hovering became excessive. We spent long evenings in the library, my sanctuary now truly shared, reading aloud to each other or simply sitting in comfortable silence while he worked on correspondence, and I embroidered tiny garments for the baby to come. Sometimes he would read poetry to me, his voice turning the words into music just as it had during that long-ago summer in Bath, and I would close my eyes and feel the perfect symmetry of it, how we had come full circle from those first conversations about literature to this domestic contentment that exceeded anything we had imagined then. My family visited, and the reunion was both joyful and bittersweet. My mother cried when she saw how happy I was, admitting that she had feared my forced marriage would be a lifetime of misery. My father, looking older and more frail than I remembered, apologized haltingly for the circumstances that had led to my marriage. I told him, with complete honesty, that I would not change anything, because the path that had seemed like sacrifice had led me to exactly where I was meant to be. Charlotte, now 17 herself and blossoming into a beauty that would surely take London by storm when she was presented, was entranced by Ashworth Manor and clearly delighted by the obvious love between Sebastian and me. She confided to me one evening that she had been terrified she had condemned me to unhappiness, and seeing me so content had lifted a guilt she had carried since learning the true circumstances of my marriage. Sebastian was gracious and generous with my family, welcoming them warmly and ensuring they understood they were always welcome at Ashworth. He arranged for my father's remaining debts to be forgiven entirely rather than merely paid, and discreetly ensured Charlotte would have a proper dowry when her time came. His kindness to them, his understanding that they were part of the life I brought to our marriage, made me love him even more. Our daughter was born on a spring morning that felt like a gift from the universe. The anniversary, we realized only afterward, of the day I had first given Sebastian that book of poetry in Bath, 9 years earlier. She came into the world with a lusty cry that announced her displeasure at being disturbed, and when the midwife placed her in my arms, I felt my heart expand in ways I had not known were possible. Sebastian, who had been pacing anxiously outside the birthing room despite my assurances I would be fine, burst in the moment he was allowed and stopped dead at the sight of us. His face went through a remarkable series of expressions: awe, joy, terror, and overwhelming love, before he cautiously approached the bed as if afraid he might disturb something sacred. When I placed our daughter in his arms for the first time, showing him how to support her tiny head, I watched this strong, capable man transform into someone utterly undone by such a small creature. He stared down at her with wonder, one finger stroking her impossibly soft cheek, and whispered that she was perfect, that she looked just like me, that he could not believe something so beautiful had come from our love. We named her Eleanor, after my grandmother, with the middle name Rose after the gardens where we had first met in Bath. Eleanor Rose Thorne, our unexpected miracle, the living symbol of a love that had survived separation and found its way home. As I watched Sebastian with our daughter in the days and weeks that followed, I saw in him a tenderness I had not known existed. He was a devoted father from the first moment, refusing to leave Eleanor's care entirely to nurses, insisting on being involved in every aspect of her life. I would find him in the nursery at odd hours, simply watching her sleep with an expression of such profound contentment it made my eyes sting with happy tears. One evening, when Eleanor was perhaps 3 months old, and we had finally established something resembling a routine, Sebastian and I found ourselves alone in the library, our daughter asleep upstairs, the house quiet around us. We sat together in his favorite chair, me curled against his side, and he asked me if I was happy. I turned to look at him, this man who had been my first love, and my forced husband, and now my true partner in all things, and I told him I was happier than I had ever imagined possible, that the life we were building together exceeded every dream I had harbored as a girl, that I woke every morning grateful for the twist of fate that had brought us back together, even if the path had been unconventional and occasionally painful. He held me closer and told me he felt the same, that marrying me had been simultaneously the most terrifying and the best decision of his life, that he had spent 8 years working toward the goal of becoming worthy of me, only to discover upon achieving it that worthiness was not about fortune or title, but about love and partnership and showing up every day determined to be the man I deserved. I told him he had always been that man, that the tutor in Bath who made me laugh and challenged my thinking and treated me as an equal had been just as worthy as the Earl of Ashworth, with his restored fortune and impeccable reputation, that what I loved was not what he had become, but who he had always been beneath the circumstances of title and wealth. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn low in the grate, and I reflected on the improbable journey that had brought us here. A summer romance cut short, 8 years of separation, a forced marriage that was secretly a reunion, and now this, a love that had been tested by time and circumstance, and emerged stronger for it. I thought about the girl I had been at 17, falling hopelessly in love with a young tutor in Bath. She could never have imagined this future, married to that same man, now an earl, with a daughter sleeping peacefully upstairs, and a love that deepened with every passing day. But perhaps in some way, she had known even then that what she felt was too powerful to be merely a summer infatuation. Perhaps her heart had recognized what her mind could not articulate, that some loves are meant to endure, no matter how impossible the circumstances might seem. And I thought about the woman I had been just months ago, sitting in my father's study, accepting a marriage to a stranger out of duty and resignation. She could never have imagined that the stranger would turn out to be her greatest love, that the forced marriage would become her greatest blessing, that duty would transform into devotion and resignation into joy. Life, I reflected, had a peculiar sense of irony. What had seemed like the end of my freedom and dreams had actually been the beginning of everything I had truly wanted, but thought lost forever. The forced marriage had given us permission to find each other again, had created the circumstances for a reunion that might never have happened if we had been left to navigate society's restrictions and our own fears of rejection. Sebastian stirred beside me, pressing a kiss to the top of my head, and asked what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about fate and second chances, about how sometimes the things we dread most turn out to be exactly what we need, about how I had been forced to marry a stranger only to discover he was the man who had always loved me, and whom I had never stopped loving, even when I convinced myself I had moved on. He was quiet for a moment, then told me that he used to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake in orchestrating our marriage the way he had. If he should have revealed himself from the beginning, trusted in our past, rather than trying to build something new. But now he thought perhaps it had unfolded exactly as it needed to. We had needed to fall in love again as the people we had become, not just as echoes of who we had been. We had needed to build a foundation based on who we were now, not just on memories of a summer 9 years past. I realized he was right. If he had simply appeared as Mr. Thorne returned from the dead, I would have been confused, hurt, angry about the years of silence. I might have accepted him out of nostalgia or duty, or simply because I was already obligated by our marriage, but it would have been shadowed by resentment and unanswered questions. Instead, I had the chance to know him as Sebastian, to fall in love with the man he had become while still recognizing the boy I had loved. Our reunion had been built on a solid foundation of new experiences and genuine connection. rather than just on the romantic memories of youth. The path had been circuitous and occasionally painful, but it had brought us somewhere better than we might have reached by a straighter road. As the fire burned down to embers and the night deepened around us, I felt Sebastian's breathing even out, felt him relax into sleep, with his arms still wrapped around me. I should have woken him, suggested we retire to our bed upstairs, but I was reluctant to move, to break the spell of this perfect moment of contentment. So I stayed where I was, wrapped in the arms of the man I loved, in the library that had become our sanctuary, in the manor that had transformed from a beautiful prison into a true home. And I thought about the future stretching before us, years of partnership and parenting, of growing old together, of watching our daughter and any children who might follow grow into their own lives. A future I had not dared dream of when I stood in that drawing room and met my husband for the first time, not recognizing him as the love I thought I had lost forever. I had been forced to marry a stranger, it was true, but the stranger had turned out to be my destiny, my partner, my greatest love, and that made all the difference. The moonlight streaming through the windows cast silver patterns across Sebastian's sleeping face, and I saw in his peaceful expression the boy from Bath and the Earl of Ashworth and the father of our child all at once. He was all of these things and more. He was home, he was safety, he was love in all its forms, and I was his, not because I was forced to be, not because of duty or obligation or legal contract, but because I chose to be. Every day, in every moment, I chose this love, this man, this life we were building together. It was, I reflected as my own eyes grew heavy, and sleep finally claimed me, the happiest ending I could have imagined, better even, because it was real. Messy and imperfect and hard-won, but real. And real, I had learned, was so much better than any fantasy could ever be. Our story had begun with separation and sorrow, had continued through years of longing and loss, and had found its way to this, contentment and joy and a love that had been tested by time and emerged victorious. It was not the story I would have written for myself, but it was exactly the story I needed. And as I drifted into sleep in Sebastian's arms, our daughter sleeping safely upstairs, and our future spreading bright before us, I offered a silent prayer of gratitude for forced marriages and stubborn hearts and second chances, for stranger husbands who turned out to be lost loves, for endings that were really beginnings in disguise, for this imperfect, impossible, perfect love that had been worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth every moment of pain to finally claim. This was our story. And it was everything. Eloise and Sebastian Thorne lived a long life together at Ashworth Manor, raising 3 children and becoming known throughout the region as one of the most devoted couples of their generation. Their love letters, discovered decades later, became a family treasure, tangible proof that true love can survive any obstacle, even time and distance. The story of the countess who was forced to marry a stranger, only to discover he was the man who had always loved her, became a local legend. A tale told to young women as a reminder that destiny has its own plans, and that sometimes what seems like an ending is merely the beginning of something extraordinary.